Let's talk about working and resting, and of course this is going to capture Sabbath principles as well as the Jubilee and the Shemitah. Here, couched within this tiny parashat Bahar, we see an awesome display of the mercy and the compassion that Hashem has for all of His created subjects, whether they be Jew or non-Jew, slave or free. Okay? The Torah speaks to every social group there. The Torah paints a picture of work and rest, slavery and freedom, which spiritually amounts to life and death. Now, how so? Well, in the renewed covenant, in the apostolic scriptures, in the book of Galatians, Rav Shaul tells us this, and let's read from chapter 6, verses 7 through 10. Quote, "Don't delude yourselves. No one makes a fool of God. A person reaps what he sows. Those who keep sowing in the field of their old nature in order to meet its demands will eventually reap ruin. But those who keep sowing in the field of the Spirit will reap from the Spirit everlasting life. So let us not grow weary of doing what is good, for if we don't give up, we will in due time reap the harvest. Therefore, as the opportunity arises, let us do what is good to everyone, and especially to the family of those who are trustingly faithful," end quote. And that's, of course, David Stern's rendering of those verses. Notice that he uses harvest language. Well, the better half of Leviticus chapter 25 uses harvest language, which is sowing and reaping, working and resting, according to faith. And in other words, to leave the ground unplowed for an entire year requires faith indeed. Wouldn't you agree? Especially living in an agricultural land such as Israel, where you can't just, like today, like if you, let's say you're living in America, and many of us living in rural America don't have a clue as to what agricultural concepts the Torah is describing, because we don't plow land, we don't work the crops, we don't live our lives according to our harvest. When we need food, we simply go down to the store and we buy the food. We don't have a concept of working and resting to sustain our very lives. But in the days of the Tanakh, and in some places of America, and of course in some places of Israel, if they don't work the land, they're not going to eat. Today, our faith lies in the fact that we have rested from our labors of self-righteousness, building on this notion of people who try to work their way to God's approval. Before our faith in Messiah, we worked year after year to meet our own needs. Surely, if we weren't working to get God's approval, we were certainly working simply to sustain ourselves. Our harvest, as it were, was the product of our own hands. We could say before we found Messiah that I have gained this, I have worked this land, and therefore the produce is mine, and I deserve to eat it. Consequently, however, based on the biblical principle that God supplies everything whether we know it or not, our harvest was a harvest of death, even though it was a harvest of provision. We got it by our own hands. But when it comes to the spiritual principle of building ourselves up instead of letting God build us up, it's a harvest of death. By contrast, to place one's trusting faithfulness in the atoning work of the Messiah, Yeshua, I might add, is to rest from one's own labors. Do you see the difference there? To be sure, without the faith of Messiah at work in our lives, we truly do not have a proper concept of Shabbat. What I'm describing here, of course, is the legalistic notion that I can earn my way to God's favor, that I can earn my way into God's places of promise, into God's covenant. Earning one's way into God's covenant is what's described as legalism in any way, in any religion. If there is a religion that is teaching that if you do X, Y, Z, God will reward you, well then, and that reward is couched in the terms of covenant membership and or eternal life, then that's tantamount to legalism. Fortunately, the Torah does not teach that. To rest, the Sabbath, remember the verbal form of Shabbat means to rest. To rest is to cease working in our own fields to try and gain God's approval by doing something for God. And once we rest, once we cease working, we begin to rest in the fields of the Master. You see how that works? When we were in the world, we were slaves to sin. Notice the terms I keep interweaving into this commentary here. Work, rest, Sabbath, fields, slaves. If you're following along in the written commentary on the middle of page 7, then you'll see that the language that I'm using is in green. It's in green color, because the green reminds me of the earth, and I'm trying to kind of tie in this notion of the earth and us. Remember how we talked about in part A about the man and his tie into the land? When we were in the world, we were slaves to sin. But now in Messiah Yeshua, we have experienced our spiritual jubilee, our spiritual yovel, our spiritual year of release. We're no longer slaves to sin. We've been set free by the power of His Sabbath rest. And in being set free by the power of His Sabbath rest, we rest in His finished work. We no longer have to work to be accepted in God's sight, as if such work would have been accepted anyway. God did not accept self-effort. God only accepts genuine, trusting faithfulness to the giver of the Torah, namely Himself, and to the Messiah found therein. Israel, in the first century, did not work so much as they sought to be accepted on the basis of who they were. It was not a legalism of doing in the first century so much as it was a legalism of being. They thought that if they could just become Jews, if they weren't already, then God would accept them into His covenant promises made with the fathers, namely salvation and a place in the world to come. Today, Christianity, as well as many streams of Judaism, seem to wrestle with this notion of doing and being. What is it that gains God's attention? And what I'm trying to explain here is that the Torah teaches us that if we want to get God's attention, if we want God's approval, then we need to surrender anything that we're doing, and we need to surrender anything that we're supposedly trying to be. What does the Torah teach us in the book of Galatians again? Quote, "What the Messiah has freed us for is freedom." This is Paul talking again. "Therefore stand firm and don't let yourselves be tied up again to a yoke of slavery." End quote. What is the slavery that Paul is describing in the first century? Again, it is not the slavery of doing that the Christian church describes today. The Christian church describes the first century Jews as ostensibly doing the Torah to be accepted before God. That's not what the slavery is that Paul's talking about. The slavery that he's referring to is the prevailing halakha that teaches that Jews and only Jews share a place in the world to come. Therefore, it is a slavery of being, not a slavery of doing. It's a slavery that says, because I am, God must accept me. And that, of course, also is legalism, but it's a different twist on legalism. It's not a legalism that says, if I do X, Y, Z, God will accept me. It's a legalism that teaches, because I am, then God must accept me. And of course, both notions are wrong. God does not accept you based on what you do, and God does not accept you based on what you are. God accepts you based on what Yeshua is and has done for you. Another place in the book of Hebrews reads this way, quote, "So there remains a Shabbat keeping for God's people. For the one who has entered God's rest has also rested from his own works." The word works there, ergon, refers to the halakha that teaches that we are, therefore God must accept us. God has rested from His own works as God. Let me read the verse again. "For the one who has entered into God's rest is also rested from his own works," the working of being, I should say, "as God did from His." And God's working actually was a doing. So there's a comparison there. "Therefore," the book of Hebrews goes on to say, "let us do our best to enter that rest." Isn't that interesting? We work to enter. Kind of a neat midrash on the terms doing and being. We work to enter the rest so that no one will fall short because of the same kind of disobedience. The rest that the writer of the book of Hebrews is offering is the rest in Messiah, the rest that Yeshua offers all who are weary and heavy laden. He says, "Come unto me and I'll offer you rest. Rest from your labors." And again, the legalism that teaches that you are, and I'm speaking to Jewish people of the first century who felt that their status of being Jewish was alone enough to secure a place in the world to come. But that's legalism. The legalism of being is actually working. Conversely, or comparatively, the legalism of doing is also working. Either way you slice it, it's legalism, and it's wrong. And so what Yeshua offers to us is a genuine rest from either a doing or a being. He says, "Come unto me, and I'll give you your true identity. And in giving you your true identity, I will fill you with my Spirit. And in filling you with my Spirit, the works that you do will be my works." So we finally have one more quote from the book of Leviticus to tie in these two quotes from the books of Galatians and Hebrews respectively. What does it say in Leviticus 26 verse 2? Quote, "Keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am Adonai." End quote. Why do I end with that verse? Because the Sabbath on the natural level is the ceasing of our malachot, our works. But the Sabbath on the spiritual level, if we want to keep God's Sabbaths, then we're commanded to enter into the rest of Messiah. Do you see it there? If God commands us to keep the Sabbath on the natural level, it means 6 days are allotted for working, and the seventh day is a ceasing from your malacha, your work. That's on the natural level. But if the Sabbath is a spiritual principle as well, which it is, Hebrews chapter 4 tells us it is, then the Sabbath rest that we are commanded to keep, as it were, is, and I'm using a quote from George, my boss, Messianic Rabbi George, in this sense, ceasing from working in the spiritual sense speaks of entering into the rest that God provides for us in the Messiah Yeshua. And so that's why I ended with the pasuk from Leviticus chapter 26 verse 2.